And speaking of things we can't talk about, Robert, let's just start with it because McAfee. For anybody who doesn't know what was going on, incidentally, shout out to Eric Hunley, Unstructured, who did, I don't know if it's one of the last interviews McAfee gave, but it's certainly one that's proving, it's prescient, the word, or relevant, where he said, and Eric put out a highlight, he is never going to pay 1 penny more of taxes. Taxation is theft. He'd paid over $50 million in taxes and was never going to do it again. Then, I forget if he was indicted before or after, but it's around the same time, he was indicted for tax evasion, tax avoidance, if you ask Kemp Brockman. And what ended up happening? The extradition request was granted. He was being held. He was arrested in Spain. And we talked about this before, which was, we were saying, you know, if you're indicted, you maybe don't go to a country that has an extradition treaty with the United States. He was a request for extradition was placed and ultimately granted. And I think it was the day that it was granted, Robert, he was found unresponsive, non-responsive, and allegedly took his own life in jail. I know what I'm inclined to think, but you have been right on so many things where you were taking a long shot being right. I am going to wholeheartedly defer to what you think is going on here, and I know you have some thoughts.
So it's a couple of things. Well, you know, McAfee faced 2 different indictments, one in the Southern District of New York for a kind of securities fraud that I thought was a real stretch, basically for him promoting cryptocurrencies and claiming he had inside benefits and things like that, that I thought was a real reach to try to claim that Southern District of New York had authority or jurisdiction over that, or that what he did was criminal. And then the other one was the tax evasion charges in Memphis, Tennessee. The state of Tennessee has the highest number of acquittals. McAfee is what the government used to call tax protesters. After all of the acquittals in the Snipes case, all the felonies, half the misdemeanors, the government decided that language wasn't good for them anymore because they said, man, that sounds like First Amendment activity. Yeah, maybe because that's what it is. So they changed it to tax deniers, making an obvious, trying to compare them to Holocaust deniers is what they were trying to do with a little verbiage. It's like a bad George Carlin skit about the change of language. He went from calling things skittish after World War I to having a big, fancy, long post-traumatic stress disorder language by the 90s. But in Tennessee, highest number of acquittals in the country for tax protester cases is the state of Tennessee. Highest number of acquittals within Tennessee is the city of Memphis. So he was being, and I was going to be potentially one of his lawyers, at least in the tax case, once the extradition went through. So he told his family, he told his wife, he told people publicly, repeatedly on social media, while he was in custody, that he would not kill himself, and that if he ended up dead, it meant somebody whacked him. Go ahead.
Oh, no, because I'm just going to say, like, this is the catch-22 sort of, I don't know if gaslighting is the right word, where the minute somebody says something like that, then it becomes already suspicious or suspect behavior in the first place, where they're in a position, they're in a point where they're talking about not doing that to themselves, which might mean that, they're sufficiently troubled that they have to make that public statement, or they think things that other people are going to say were delusional thoughts, that other people are coming to get them, so they have to say that. So just by making that statement, it's already going to, justify to some the conclusion that he did in fact do it to himself.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one interpretation. The thing is, couple of things. One is McAfee had good defenses, so there was no reason to tremendously fear these particular cases. It's not like it was a done deal, in my view, in either jurisdiction. They were pursuing novel interpretations of the law and the prosecution of them in New York, and in Tennessee, it's called a good faith defense and a reliance defense, which we'll get into a little bit later on the Trump part of the reliance defense. In his part, in America, you cannot be put in prison for either debt or dissent. That means the mere fact you owe the government money doesn't mean you go to prison for taxes. And the mere fact that you disagree with the IRS about the application of the tax laws doesn't mean you go to prison. Wesley Snipes was accused of saying far more problematic things in the public opinion perspective than McAfee had said. So McAfee had a robust defense on those charges. That's part one. Part two is he had been talking about this not only while he was in custody, but he'd been talking about this for more than a decade. People can go watch. He used to tell Alex Jones this repeatedly. He goes, why am I not in the United States very often? He said, very simple. I think they'll find an excuse to lock me up, and I don't want to be found dead in a cell hanging from the cell. And he said, I think that's what they'll do to me. So he's been talking about this for more than 12 years. So, he said this is the end game of what they want to do. That's at least what he was. And I think he thought by publicly stating it repeatedly, that would be its best deterrence from it occurring. But the Jeffrey Epstein case proved otherwise. So that's part two. Part three is he doesn't fit the personality of a suicidal person. Suicidal people are people who generally internalize blame. So I've dealt with a lot of jail suicide cases, cases of wrongful suicide, cases where we suspect somebody else was involved, cases where the jail or prison failed to safely prevent the suicide, including people involuntarily institutionalized. Relates to legal issues that Britney Spears is also facing currently, which we'll get to. But in that context, McAfee did not fit the psychological profile of someone who internalized blame. Quite the opposite. Usually your grandiose personalities that promote themselves as much as he does are very rarely your suicide candidates. And then last but not least, these prisons and facilities. Now, I don't know the particular jail in Spain, but they are generally designed over the last 20 years to make it almost impossible for you to kill yourself. And one addendum to all of this, he had claimed that he had files on the Clintons. He had claimed he had files on powerful people. And the timing struck me as odd. He's suddenly so depressed that he whacks himself on the day he gets extradited. When he was bragging about his defenses, that just struck me as suspicious. It was all of a sudden when he's going to be in U.S. custody. If somebody wanted him dead, that was the time to do it once they knew he was coming back to U.S. custody.
I'm gonna actually ask you on that before I get to what I was going to say. Why would that be the point? Like, he's going to get extradited. They're going to bring him back. What risk would he be? What greater risk would he be back in the United States as if that he had not already been either on his boat or in a Spanish prison?
The belief that he would now, when he was actually facing trial, two risks. One is that they would no longer they may have had access to him in Spain in ways they did not believe they would have access to him in the United States. He might have gone to Memphis first rather than New York. New York's obviously under massive pressure had he gone to New York not to allow another high-profile suicide case. So that may have been problem one, access. Problem two may have been that they believe that he would, as a negotiating leverage, use information he had to try to get out of any situation he currently faced. That may have been information he developed in the cryptocurrency markets because there's a lot of interesting people in those markets. It might not even be like deep state government type actors. It could just be other corrupt people that he knew who he could implicate as a negotiating leverage to get, because the timing of it was always weird. The timing of indicting him. It's like he's in his mid 70s. Now is when you choose to indict him. You sort of stack the charges from tax to, the very questionable securities fraud case in order to be able to get him extradited. A lot of it seemed like their objective must have been something other than just him. So those would be the two potential reasons for the timing. Whereas I don't see him suddenly getting overwhelmingly depressed and killing himself because of it.
So these are my thoughts, and they might be superficial or definitely not next level. I've known in the practice and in my life multiple people who have done this to themselves, and sometimes it's obvious, it's plain as whatever. Things are not going right. They're either mentally unwell and not taking medication or whatever. Other times it was as much of a shock as you could possibly imagine. And when I look at McAfee, and he's call it a wild dog, but not in the insulting term. He's just a wild, free animal that now faces the prospect not only of being in prison for the rest of his life, when he was on a yacht with a shotgun, living the life of an absolute gangster, for lack of a better word. Now he's facing the prospect of, if not the rest of his life in jail because of a conviction, at the very least, the rest of his life fighting the government, who might, at the end of the day, have the last laugh by seizing whatever cryptocurrencies, the millions that he might have and that he probably does have. And this is his last FU to the government. Someone who cannot possibly bear the idea of a leash, of a cage. And the last FU is, I've lived a good life, and now I'm going to take my cryptocurrency and my millions with me, and you're never going to see it, whereas you might have otherwise been able to seize it through whatever. Why would that be the superficial way of looking at it?
I think a couple different components there. One is that he doesn't generally fit the profile of someone who commits suicide, as part one. Part two, he constantly said he wouldn't do it, and said if it happened, that meant somebody whacked him. And then third, he's 75. What he had publicly stated, and I believe this to be true for other reasons, was very low on resources. So most of the cryptocurrency was already gone. So that wouldn't have been a particular risk for him. And this is a guy who always loved the limelight and loved the stage. And there'd been no suicide attempts ever reported out of the Spanish jail. No suicide attempts ever before in his life. And he had other times where if he was crazy or if he was worried where he was in high stress situations. I mean, he was wanted in Belize and had to try to escape and all these different stories. He did say he had a personal vendetta against the Clintons and had sought out information because purportedly Hillary Clinton denied him access to an embassy when he was trying to escape some people trying to kill him. So it's like he's had all these opportunities to do this. And I just take him at his word and his family's word, who said that, he had been saying for a dozen years, if you find me hanging in a cell, I didn't do it to myself.
And now, I mean, I say what's there. There are those out there who incidentally don't believe that he actually did this, that he's still alive, that this is part of another plan. I will not call that the name that other people are calling it, because in the world in which we live, I guess there have been more absurd things that have actually been true. But what happens now? This is the end of it.
Hopefully there'll be a meaningful inquest in Spain and we'll find out some answers. But if we get another Epstein, Bill Barr style cover up, then that will increase my suspicions as to what took place here.
No, it's like we haven't heard as to whether or not there were malfunctioning cameras, guards who were not checking in. I don't know where he was in Spain. I know people think they know of the prison that he was in. I don't know. I don't want to venture a guess, but I would operate on the basis that the prisons in Spain are even less secure and less trustworthy, or maybe than the ones in the States. And it's
they're usually lighter. Usually it's harder. It's still hard to commit suicide in those facilities, but usually they're not as intense. They're not. But it really depends on the facility. But they're usually not that brutal of a facility to be in. So that's sort of the cap. I mean, as to the theory that this was a big escape plan, there's always an outside chance of that, but I'd say it's pretty remote.
Has there ever been a case like that in real life where there was either a faked or set up death that ended up being just a way to smuggle a person out? But why would they have to do that? He was being indicted anyhow. He was being extradited anyhow. It'd be totally useless to do that. Yeah,
I mean, that would only be the only way I see that as credible is if they think McAfee himself orchestrated it, that he lied about not having any money left, that he bought off some guards, that if he was going to get extradited, that they would smuggle him out and tell everybody he was dead. Spain's not that kind of jurisdiction in general. It's not like, I mean, there's some places I could see that. It's just Spain seems less likely. But you never know. I mean, it's not impossible. I have not heard of a historical example of it, but there probably is one out there somewhere.
All right. Well, it's just another example, like rubbing it in the face of the general population that you're not safe once the government sets its sights on you. You're not safe from yourself. And I don't know who's going to believe. Oh, that was what I was going to say. In the chat, people, let's just see what the general consensus is. 1, he did this to himself. And 2, he did not do this to himself. Someone did this to him. Let's see what the consensus is. I expect to see a lot of 2s, but I think there should be a fair share of 1s. I mean, I think what I believe is that he could not foresee the rest of his life being anything less than what it was from before. And it's true. I don't know about what resources he had left. I was operating on the basis that he had enough, that he didn't want to see the government take it and they would have the last laugh. But who knows? Let's see what we got in the chat. Who says 3 mystics? Come on.